Welcome to this research talk for the Open University Research Center. My name is Sandra Obradovich. I am a lecturer in psychology at the Open University, and it is a great pleasure for me today to be here in conversation with two of my colleagues and mentor as well. So let me first introduce who I have with me today, and hopefully you'll enjoy this conversation that we're about to have on the topic of social and cultural psychology and how it is applied to real world issues. So firstly, today we have with us Professor Sandra Jovcelovic, Director of the Master's Program in Social and Cultural Psychology at the London School of Economics, and Maria Cecilia de Dios, who is from the School of Government, Los Andes University in Colombia. Now, these two women are brilliant scholars and brilliant social and cultural psychologists, and I'm very delighted to get to introduce their work today and for you to hear more about the ways in which they have used social and cultural psychology to better the world. Now, before you get to hear a bit about their work, I wanted to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and to tell you a little bit about how they came into this field of research. So, Sandra, maybe you can start us off and tell us a little bit about your journey into becoming a social and cultural psychologist.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Sandra, very much for inviting me to have this conversation with you and Maria Cecilia. Of course, as you can imagine, for me, it's a great pleasure to see this strong young women of psychological science here having this conversation with me. And social and cultural psychology, in particular, is a passion of ours. So I'm really very, very pleased. So, how did I come into this field? I trained quite a long time ago now, in psychology. And I trained initially as a clinical psychologist. So, I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I spent my formative years in the profession working in the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill in Brazil, working with psychiatrists, activists, psychologists, sociologists on how we could rethink the care of the mentally ill and how we could address issues related to the positioning of madness in society. So that was very integral to my training and to my formation as a psychologist. That was coinciding very much with the redemocratization of Brazil and with the development of our national health system. So all these things, psychology, mental illness, institutionalization, deinstitutionalization, healthcare, were somehow entangled in my mind as a young psychologist. And when the opportunity came for me to do my PhD abroad, I decided to come from the UK. And you might ask me later, I mean, the rest is history, as they say. Life takes turns that you never imagine. But I wanted to do a PhD in social and cultural psychology because it became very clear to me as my career progressed in Brazil, as I was working public health, I was working with deprived barrios and favelas in the outskirts of the city, that the mental hospital and the attention that we're giving to the mentally ill sometimes were more related to the causes of mental illness than with their solutions. And it was very clear in our discussion that if you don't address the social determinants of health, if you do understand the cultures that build representations about what mental health and mental illness are, you'll never be able to connect proper attention, proper health care to quality of life, to citizenship, to societal issues. So I came to the LSE to do a PhD. I became very entangled in the discussions related to social psychology, sociocultural psychology, and I never looked back. Here I am. That's the story.
That is a great story. And Maria Cecilia and I both did our PhDs. Well, we both did the master's program in social and cultural psychology, and we both did our PhDs at the LSE. So there's something about that experience at the LSE that stays with you for quite some time. Maria Cecilia, maybe you can share a bit as well about your journey into this discipline and the research.
Absolutely. And then again, thank you, Sandra, for the invitation. I am also very happy to be having this conversation with you too. It's very exciting. Let's see how to shorten a long story. I'm originally from Peru. I initially trained as Sandra as a clinical psychologist. So my introduction to the first questioning really of what I had learned was my first experience as a clinical psychology in working with indigenous populations in Peru, in the Andean region of Peru, where I quickly started realizing through little things how you interact with people, how people define themselves or think of themselves, how distant in a way was what I had learned in college as an undergraduate with the reality that I was listening to. So things such as very common questions in psychology, such as, please define yourself, or who are you? Tell me who you are. That was a very, very alien question to people. So they would go, well, I'm a sister, I'm a part of a community, all these relational aspects that we don't necessarily consider as important in the West, right? So that got me very, very interested in cultural variations in cognition and in how the mind works across cultures. So that was the first thing. And that was the point where I decided, no, I need to do research. I don't want to practice clinical psychology. And then just life experience. I've traveled, I've lived in various different countries where it became even more real, like these differences in how people are, how people define themselves. And while living in the US, I started working on the issue of migration and mental health, working with, in general, Latin American immigrants to the US, where then again, the issue of relationships and kind of like, how people think of themselves as a part of a network was, and how that was not being covered in the theory and in the practice I was making, got me this, deciding that I wanted to do a PhD in social and cultural psychology. I explored anthropology, cultural psychology, psychological anthropology, all these related fields that, are basically with their nuances talking to the same thing, variations in cognition across cultures and across time as well. And then, reading people's work, right? Like Jones Miller work, Rick Schrader work, of course, Sandra's work, Moscovici's work. I was like, this is where, my attention is set. And that's how I decided to do a PhD in social and cultural with Sandra. So and then after that, we've been working together in various projects where we're applying all these insights in Colombia at the moment. So that would be it, I think.
That's great. Thank you. And part of the reason why I really wanted to have both of you here today is because I think the work that you do really speaks to the value of social and cultural psychology in the real world. I think for a lot of people, the concepts that we use might seem a bit foreign, but it really is in the applied work that we see the value of what this perspective brings to understanding society, social relations, social issues, and how sort of the social and cultural is always a part of anything that we're experiencing in life, whether it's the most dry institutional experiences or the most sort of personal of things. I wanted to ask you both to maybe share a little bit about your experience sort of doing applied work in social and cultural psychology. I know you worked most recently in Colombia and that you still continue to work in that context. So I wanted to ask if you could maybe share a little bit about that experience, both in terms of the benefits of working in a very applied way, but also as both of you are quite intense fieldwork psychologists and fieldwork researchers, some of the potential challenges that might come with again, trying to do this kind of applied work. So I don't know which one of you would like to start us off. I know it's a big question, but I know it's also one that both of you are quite passionate about.
The first thing I want to say is that I think there is a fundamental connection between theory and practice. And as you know, I think we have always worked with that view from Kurt Lewin. There is nothing as practical as a good theory. And for me, having concepts clear in my mind and having a good theoretical grounding is really essential for doing applied work and for doing applied research. And that conversation between theory and practice, I find really, really productive and necessary because it qualifies what we do practically and also feeds back into theory and develops our concepts and our theoretical approaches. So that's something for me very crucial in designing good applied work. Now, being an applied psychologist is very central to my identity because I feel that it's only when we are out there talking to people that we get a real sense, as it were, for what the human psychological landscape is about. You know, when you are out in the field observing people in their contexts, talking to people and getting their experiences and perspectives, that's what gives you a sense of human psychology is about. One of my, I'm a firm believer in multiple methodologies and in the importance of multiple methodologies, but sometimes I despair when I see psychological science being excessively dominated, say, by technologies that do not enable young psychologists to talk to people, to experience that face-to-face interaction with the human, that really is what gives us a connection to psychological phenomena. So I think that this is incredibly important to get out there and to try to spend some time in some kind of field, observing what people do, observing what people say, observing how people relate. So that's a very general point. Now, a lot of my research, and with Maria Cecilia, and as you know, Sandra, is in what we call contexts of adversity, and that's mainly in Latin America. So what we define as adversity are contexts characterized by three things mainly: violence, poverty, and stigma. So people who have to live under these three conditions, or two sometimes, or usually in our work, we find all of them intermingled. That's what we do. And I think it has been very important for us to understand that the culture of poverty or the culture of violence is not a homogeneous culture, that there is a great deal of individuality, nuance, differentiation in this context. A lot of social science or a lot of psychology treats this as a kind of sweeping generalization, right? All based on numbers. And I think what Maria Cecilia's research has shown, many of my other students' research has shown, my own experience in Colombia before, in Rio, in the favelas has shown, is that there is a huge amount of diversity and psychological nuance in this kind of context. And I think a lot of what our lab wants to do and our current research wants to do is to militate against first the idea that contexts of poverty produce poor mental skills. This is wrong. This is plainly wrong. The poor are incredibly sophisticated in the way they think. They are incredibly resourceful in their cognition and in the adaptive strategies they develop to survive. And second, don't homogenize the poor because they are not all the same. There is a lot of differentiation in context of poverty, and this multiple cultures that make the culture of poverty need to be attended to. And I think as social and cultural psychologists, our contribution is to go a bit more into this tribe, as it were, in the same way when you study children or you study specific nations that are usually the token we use for culture. For us, we treat that specific landscape as a culture of sorts.
Mm.
And yes, that's what I think I would
Great.
have to say. You carry on, Maria Cecilia. Over to you.
Of course, my pleasure. So yeah, I guess a big part of what we do is, as you said, trying to figure out what's happening on the ground, and that requires talking to people, being in the context. So it should be said that we have a strong emphasis on using methodological tools that are mainly qualitative.
Mm.
Although we both work in the field of mixed methods, we're happy to mix. But as I was saying before, there is a lot of theory to be refined and nuanced in how we think of different contexts, different cultures. And so a big part of our work is just doing that. It's taking concepts, bringing them to the field and seeing how these concepts work, do not work, or should be enriched or nuanced or reconceptualized based on a exploratory and descriptive in-depth work. So that's one thing. And yes, I agree with Sandra in how there is a risk when we're just collecting that data in faraway countries or faraway contexts while we're not there. Of course, we will find differences, but it doesn't mean that those differences work in those ways in the places where we're researching. So there's a question of validity, a big question of validity that needs to be addressed. And the kind of work that is needed to address that validity issue is in-depth work. So that's one thing. And the other, well, let me not get ahead of myself here. So I'll briefly describe what we're doing in Colombia. So we currently have two projects. One is we're working with adult and young people in 7 areas of the country that were particularly hardly hit by the conflict. So there in Colombia, there is a long history, decades-long history of political conflict. The conflict is, well, the government and the biggest guerrilla in the country reached a peace agreement 5 years ago. And now we're in this period broadly defined as post-conflict. The country still has to figure out what that means in terms of how the transition is much more complicated than only signing the peace agreement, although that was a big step. So we're working in this liminal moment, right? And we're trying to figure out the impact that an intervention on forgiveness and reconciliation has in 3 main aspects. So mental health, social capital, and positive life tracks. So we see these things as interrelated. Then again, bringing this back into how we define well-being, right? In Colombia, it's not only about mental health. It obviously has something to do with relationships and social capital. And in this context, it also means how people imagine themselves into the future. How do they see themselves in 5 years, 10 years, like that, the expectations they can develop for themselves in this violent, poor, and stigmatized contexts. So that's one thing. And we have a longitudinal design. We're using qualitative and quantitative techniques, and we have 4 points. We're measuring outcomes, quantitative and qualitative outcomes, at 4 different points. So that's the first one. We can talk in more depth about the first one in a minute. And then the second one, we're just getting started. And that one is a participatory action research approach. We're working in Caquetá, which is one part. It's a region of the country that it's very, very interesting. It's a very civil society, super organized in Caquetá. At the same time, it was a place where the FARC, the main guerrilla group of the country, was born. So it's a very interesting place to understand well-being. So that's what we're studying in this new study. It's mental health, well-being, but then we have an entire year of fieldwork to figure out how these populations define well-being and mental health. Are they using the same concepts we do? Is there anything that we should include? And we have had just a couple of meetings with them, and it's already obvious that we're just understanding a little tiny bit of how they define, or our definition is very narrow. Their definition is much more broader and includes issues that have to do, for instance, with the relationship between the mental health institutions and the government, with people who chose to join the guerrillas or not. So these political aspects that as clinical psychologists, you don't necessarily consider into your definition of mental health. So that's what we do, really. We go out, we check with so-called populations of interests, and we take them seriously. And then we try to include their views and their perspectives into how we theorize psychology in general.
That's great. No, thank you both. And I think that's something that a lot of us who are in the discipline of social and cultural psychology, you know, we do like to talk to people. We do like to engage with how people construct their own worlds and how that has an impact on how they engage with relevant others, how they use specific services, how they, you know, build public spheres or engage with public spheres and all these things. And I think that's a real strength to me of social and cultural psychology, and a real, one of the key things that appealed to me with this sort of discipline in the beginning, that it was not saying that we have theory and theory defines methods and, you know, this is, you know, these are the predictions that we have, but rather to say we have theory, but how do we contextualize theory and how do we bring in sort of the messiness of human life rather than shying away from it. So Sandra, you were talking about this idea of variability, right? Something that's really important to account for rather than dismiss in order to understand the complexity of the things that we research. But I also think, on the other hand, with that, for those of us who do this kind of research, you know, we don't research always the most happiest of topics. You know, we research social issues and problems that we want to be a part of addressing and solving. How do you guys, maybe to sort of look at the point a bit of sort of some of the challenges of doing field work, how do you manage that element of, you know, being a person, but also being a researcher, going into these contexts and these contexts of adversity, as you were saying, Sandra, and still sort of managing to do that research, but, you know, also engage with the fact that these are people's lived realities. And for a lot of people, this lived reality is not, you know, it's tough, it's difficult. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I think it's a real challenge that most sociocultural psychologists will face at one point in their career.
Definitely. Yes, that's a very good and important point, you know, and I have, it's a point that somehow I think follows all of us who work with some kind of pressing social issue that is causing some kind of adversity or tough experiences for people. So to give you an example from my long, you know, I had a long time working in the favelas of Rio in Brazil. So the favelas of Rio de Janeiro are one of the most complex cultural environments I have been in my whole life. They are universes of their own in a way, because they are communities that are somehow segregated from the wider public sphere of the city and are very much experienced as communities. People who live there, they feel they come from, say, the favela Cantagalo. They come from Vigário Geral, even before they come from Rio or from Brazil. And one of the key issues we found in the favelas was the level of human suffering that was present in that environment, because not only because people are exposed to poverty and all the material consequences of poverty, but the amount of human loss that comes with violence is something sometimes very difficult to imagine. You know, here in the West, someone is killed and we rightly so feel shocked about it. You have to understand that in a favela environment, that is part of everyday life, really. Losing someone is part of everyday life, and the pain is not diminished because of that. So there is a huge amount of pain. And I remember the first lab with my researchers, when we finished analyzing the interviews, everyone was emotionally exhausted, just because of the stories we're listening to, the stories we're hearing. So that's very tough. On the other hand, I think the favelas were one of the places where I found the most high levels of resilience I have ever encountered in my life. A huge amount of spirit in the old sense of the world, people who are spirited, who can really face adversity with a lot of good humor, who can laugh, who can sing, who can enjoy life, who can enjoy sociability. That's what we call the research underground sociability, because it's based on that idea that there is joy to be taken out of the social, when you are with friends, when you are with. So I would say it's always important to keep that contradiction in mind, and that helps. That helps when we address tough social issues, because whatever the toughness, there will be a niche of agency there. There will be a niche of the resilience of the human spirit, shining through the psychology of people. And if we connect to that, it makes it more bearable. And it also makes it important to bring out that. So I think for our experience, Maria Cecilia can say more about that. It's very important for us to highlight that resilience, to highlight that agency of the populations we work with. It's not all about suffering and poverty and darkness. There is a lot of life in there, and there is a lot of resilience, and there is a lot of agency as well.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that I fully agree. I mean, I guess you're right in saying that you are usually working in contexts that, with people conveying to you gigantic, amounts of pain and adversity, really. But one thing that becomes very evident when one starts to spend more time in this context is the huge heterogeneity of the experiences. And that is under no circumstances to deny the amount of pain and suffering and injustice that you can see in these contexts. But there is variability, and it's important to register that as well. So on one hand, I think it's very important to validate the suffering as well. People feel actually very validated when you sit down to talk to them. Many of, the interviews go something like, I had never been asked about this experience before. And so finding that space to talk to people, like connect in a human way, it's very, I wouldn't call it satisfying, but it's very important. And ethically, it has to be done. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, then again, the resilience, which amazes me every time. It's really humbling how people in these contexts can carry on with their lives, find ways to manage the adversity. And then again, not everything is suffering. People have agency, people have resources, people figure out ways, right? Organizing as individuals and mostly as communities to find solutions that work for them. So that's one important thing. And the other thing is that despite being working in these contexts, it's very, like, the motivation is that you're doing work that matters. Like, you're working in like big, important issues. And then you can try to make a contribution to solving this particular issue that, gets your attention, not only theoretically or conceptually, but something that touches you in a way that you go like, I have to do something about this. So that's one thing. And I guess you were asking before about the challenges, right? And one thing that concerned me when I was finishing my PhD, and I was like thinking about this a lot, is how do you go from doing research to taking that next step to just actually make something change? And I think that was a big part of my decision to go to a school of government, which was the opportunity to engage with policymaking, which it's very important. And I think us psychologists in general should and can do a better job on getting involved in decision making, how a program may be built, how do we use the theory and all the things that the field has to offer to produce practical interventions, like things that change people's lives. So I guess that was a big challenge that I kind of like decided to get heads on by getting myself involved in policy world. And actually collaborating with people in other disciplines, right? Like economists, medical doctors, public policy people. So that's a very productive conversation that I think we can, further from within the field. It would be very important.
Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. There was one thing I wanted to touch upon, which is thinking about, both of you also, you don't only do research, but you also sort of teach within this discipline. When you think about someone sort of coming to social and cultural psychology for the first time, or someone who might be interested in this discipline but knows nothing about it, what would you tell them is sort of the key thing that they can get from engaging with social and cultural psychology? I realize this is a big question, but thinking about, someone who doesn't know anything about what we do, essentially, what do you think is the key thing to communicate about what social and cultural psychology means?
I am convinced that social and cultural psychology is probably one of the most comprehensive fields of psychology, of psychological science as a whole, because it's a combination of aspects of social psychology, of course, developmental psychology, very important. We engage a lot with the development of Homo sapiens, the development of the human child, as empirical opportunities to understand what makes us human and what makes us cultural beings. So you get a huge amount of psychology from that particular combination. And on top of that, a social and cultural psychologist is someone who is also versant, will get acquainted with other fields of the social sciences, in particular, say, anthropology, sociology, a bit of political science as well. So it brings an interdisciplinary angle to being a psychologist that I find personally rewarding, and educationally is fantastic because it puts you in touch with so many different ideas and fields, and it makes you, I think, a better psychologist. Okay, a more, a psychologist with a wider take into the world, into what makes us human. So I think this is really important. The other aspect I would say that for me is very important, is becoming more and more important, is that there are many psychologists out there. And sadly, we live in an environment where the political economy of knowledge production has made many of the psychologists invisible, and has made one or two of the psychologists perhaps too dominant. And it's time to undo that invisibility and to bring to the fore all the multiple psychologists that have been constructed and developed, say, in Turkey, in Eastern Europe, in Africa, in India, in Latin America. And these psychologists are absolutely essential to make us understand the global nature of psychological science. We need to move away from, and I don't even like to use the concept weird anymore, because it was only when some colleagues, I mean, great work, in the US, I have nothing against that, but it was only when some colleagues in the US pointed to the fact that most of psychological science is a psychology focused on Western educated, industrialized, and rich people, that psychology seemed to have woken up to the fact that this is the case. When I can think of the work of Martin Barreau in Latin America, of Ashish Nanji in India, just to mention two, but there are, of Kachibati in Turkey. She was talking about the majority world well before people started to talk about weird psychology. So I just really hope that we can rebalance a bit the dominance of psychological science and build a truly global, more equal psychology that takes into account the different perspectives that are out there in the world.
No, that's a great point. I think, and it is important, and as well, I think something that pandemic that we're all experiencing right now has taught us is that, you know, a global challenge is global, but it's also handled in many different ways across cultures and communities. And we need to look at all of those things and understand how people deal with being resilient, with managing community, with you know, well-being in all the different ways that they are contextualized. So I think that's a very nice point. Maria Cecilia, what would you say to someone who doesn't know anything about social and cultural psychology?
Yeah, I guess to me, the most, I mean, in addition to what Sandra just said, which I then again fully support, I guess the issue of diversity and pluralism is crucial in how we approach and what you gain from the field of social and cultural psychology. So I guess the field, by means of requiring you to know not only about psychology, but anthropology, sociology, history in many cases, right? How the mind changes across time, but also space. It requires you, or it brings you to the conclusion of how rich the human experience is, and how diverse, and how, you know, different populations across the world construct the social space and the social world in various different ways. And it's not, and this is anchoring to how we approach psychology, then again, from a qualitative perspective, right? It's just different perspectives of one reality, which is not one single objective reality.
Yeah.
So the field kind of like forces you to translate this into practice and theory that in the end makes for a better psychology. So I fully agree with Sandra, like that's a better way of approaching what's really happening out there. And then, yes, I guess one of the things that one should know and take into consideration when entering this field is that there is a lot of work to do ahead. And that's pretty exciting, basically because, yeah, these discussions about the weird psychology and non-weird populations, I do think it's an important step. I think it's important that the world is paying attention, like the academic world is paying attention to that. I do agree that it was long due that required attention. These are things that academics outside the West or the high income countries have been saying for decades, right? But I guess it's an important step in the fact that there is like a new way for more grants, for instance, more attention put into how can we conduct studies in these various different contexts, and that's something positive. Yeah, but then again, it's a good first step, but I think there is much more work to do in defining. So the current differentiations, right, are weird, non-weird, high income, low income, global north, global south, and that I think that minimizes the variety within what we call the global south or low income, middle income, etc. So we cannot, work on this division of, for instance, independent and interdependent cultures, because that's only specifying the independent cultures, and there's huge variation in the interdependent cultures that we're not tackling yet. So India is not the same as Japan. Japan is not the same as Colombia, or Colombia is not even the same as Peru. So we need much more work on refining that, like not only centering ourselves in what we can learn from the difference, but also what's out there, what's in these like far away countries or contexts that of course need more specification and more attention in how things work there. So I think you could think of this program as the in-group and out-group paradigm, right? Like you can spot so many differences in your in-group, but then the out-group is this homogeneous group that it's just different from me, and that requires more work, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think you both bring up the fact that, embracing messiness of human life as not a problem, but as a benefit, right? And as something that really can allow for resilience and for creativity and for sociality to be expressed in so many different ways. But also, as I think both of you make clear, this is that being a sociocultural psychologist requires a lot of work, you know. I think a lot of people have a misconception about qualitative research that it's easy, but it's so difficult. It's so difficult getting access to a field, gaining trust from people to open up and speak to you about their life and their experiences, and then being able to do those accounts justice and being able to do the variability and diversity of perspectives justice in terms of thinking about developing policy recommendations or refining theory or sort of practical tools. So I think both of you are great examples of how something very complex is seen as very simple in terms of the work that you do and the ways in which you communicate about social and cultural psychology. But I think what you both highlight is definitely that it is a rich discipline, and that richness is difficult to handle sometimes, but it's always rewarding when you're able to do so. So I wanted to just stop here and sort of get any final thoughts that you maybe wanted to share, thinking about the future of sociocultural psychology. I mean, we've all been going through this global pandemic, and a lot of our ability to engage in sort of important social practices and community practices and, you know, engaging with public spaces has all been so massively restricted. And to me, I think it's evidence of the need for social and cultural psychology. It's evidence for the need that no matter how digitally or technologically advanced we become as societies, there's a fundamental need for human interpersonal social connectedness that can never just be achieved in the same way digitally as it can be in a community context. So that's sort of something that I take away in all of this working from home forever, that I take away as a sort of reward of being in a discipline that's showing me, and in a field that's showing me, that the research that we do will never be lost, and it will never be unnecessary, because no matter what sort of changes we go through in society, that seems to be a constant. That social need seems to be a constant. So I just wanted to get your sort of thoughts on this, thinking ahead, thinking about the future.
So I'm going to go first, just to I think this is it's a really challenging thought, and to think about social and cultural psychology in the future in the context of a pandemic certainly gives a huge amount of food for thought. Mm. I agree with you entirely. I think that this pandemic brought back to all of us the importance of just being together in the joy of sociability, of that time and that space that we spend with people we love and like, our friends, our family, our co-workers, people with whom we do things together in a co-physical, in presence, you know, sharing the moment, sharing the perception, the qualia of the moment, the feel of the air, the whatever is the stimuli that goes around you at the moment, whoever passes by you, and you can just exchange a glance and perhaps laugh it out or think it was weird. All those minimal forms of expression, you know, that come out of being together. I think this is definitely something we're all desperate to have back, and we're all missing everywhere around the globe. I always say, you know, for me as a psychologist, looking at development has always been important, and looking at the development of a baby has always been an inroad to understand what makes us tick as humans. So no human baby can be brought up digitally, okay? The basics of the survival of a human child is that not only of milk lives a human child. You know, it needs the support, the care, the love, the smells, the comfort, the touch, all the embodiment of psychological experience that comes with so much: gaze, touch, sensation. So that's something that the pandemic is teaching us again. And the other thing is, it's teaching us our dark side as well. You know, I despair when I look at the Scrabble for vaccination. I'm very disappointed with narratives of nationalism being attached to vaccination practices. That was the time to do, you know, science, I think, had an amazing trajectory. We developed vaccines, scientists worked together. There was collaboration across the globe in terms of trials, in terms of different research institutes developing. And now we're seeing a really poor show of linking vaccination to nationalism of the worst kind, you know, because I think that there is something good about nationalism there, about belonging and a sense of identity. But it's that form of, you know, very, you know, not really grown up politics. And I think, as you said, we're much better off if we look around the globe and if we learn from each other's experiences. And if we understand that it's only going to be together that we're ever going to overcome a pandemic. But it seems to me that there is a long way to go. And that's why cultural psychology needs social psychology, you know, because it's social psychology that will be able to explain this intergroup relations dynamic that has been established during the pandemic, the politics of public spheres, the political psychology of it all. So I think this is something that is going to definitely reverberate also on the future of social and cultural psychology.
Yeah, I guess that's a big question what you pose. I think one of the things where cultural psychology, social and cultural psychology can contribute more is this aspect of multiculturalism that we see now, you know, more than ever. Despite the pandemic, like, or before the pandemic, we have, you know, large trends of migration that will only continue to increase in the coming decades. And so I think by means of recognizing, then again, different worldviews, different perspectives, different ways of approaching reality, so the field has a lot of to contribute to just a better understanding, which is not to say that this will be an easy task to achieve. Like, understanding different realities is perhaps one of the most toughest things to do, right? When someone is looking at the same thing I'm looking, and then disagreeing on what that means or what it is really, right? But it has, like, the work has to be started somewhere. So I think the field has this huge potential to contribute to, then again, recognizing diversity and recognizing various points of view and putting them on the same ontological level, on a way. Like, it's not that one view weights or it's more important or more valid than the other. So that's one thing that I think the field can contribute specifically. And the other thing, as you were talking about the pandemic, I was thinking that I think there will be something that will stay after the pandemic in how we communicate. Things have changed. I think, I mean, I guess we're all just dying to be able to just reconnect to people and traveling again and then seeing our loved ones again. But we've been in this situation for so long, and we as humans would be expected to have adapted to some point to this new situation. So I think some things will, like in how we communicate, will remain. And I also think of this as a generational thing, because I see us, for instance, just dealing with this in a very different way as, you know, my students do, for instance, where they are just way much more used to communicate to people through virtual means, cell phones, computers, etc. So I guess we do, as human beings, absolutely need relationships and face-to-face contact, but there's something new developing that, of course, the field will have to tackle in terms of, you know, then again, empirical studies and trying to understand in more depth what's happening in this virtual reality that we're all immersed now, and we will remain immersed for the future. So in the future, so I think that's a possible pathway in which the field can contribute further to knowledge.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for taking this time to have this conversation with me. It feels like we are back in Sandra's office and having a cup of coffee and chatting about how we're going to change the world. So even though we're not in that space, I'm glad to see that we can still have those conversations and those sort of exchange of ideas. So thank you again both for joining me for this conversation, and to those who have been listening, thank you for tuning in, and hopefully you found this an interesting introduction into some of the ways in which sociocultural psychologists do research and engage with the world.